welcome everybody. Welcome to this, on Gandhi's birthday. Welcome to the Gandhi oration. I'm Robert Johansson. I'm the chair of the Australia-India Institute, and I'll be chairing tonight's proceedings. So I'll just give you a quick run through of the sequence we'll do tonight. First, we're going to have a book launch. Then we'll go into the oration to be given by Shankar Aiyar, commentary by Ashok Malik, and then we'll have opportunity for questions or discussion. But I think tonight we should have a very interesting discussion about Gandhi and those things. But first, I'd like to. We're going to officially launch this new book, edited by our own Professor Amitabh Matu, but also Marlene Kanga. Now, the book is called Hullabaloo, The Fuss About the India-Australia Relationship. And we've had a bit of fuss this afternoon about where the word hullabaloo comes from. The Oxford English Dictionary comprehends no possibility except that it came from Scotland, first appearing in about 1760, but Amitabh did find an entry in Wikipedia which found its source in much earlier words in northern India, and it's not inconceivable that it found its way to Scotland. Those of you who've read, as I have, those wonderful books by William Dalrymple will know of the many Scots who found themselves flourishing in India in the 18th century. So it's not at all inconceivable that's how it found its way back to Scotland. Anyway, this book is about the fuss, as I said, about the fuss about the India-Australia relationship, and I'd like to invite one of the editors, Marlene Kanga, to come and address us. Marlene, Dr. Kanga is a leading Australian engineer. She's the first Asian-born national president of Engineers Australia. She graduated from the Indian Institute of Technology in Bombay. She completed a master's degree at Imperial College London, a PhD at Macquarie University, and she's a distinguished fellow of the Australia-India Institute. She's a director of a number of corporations. She's a board member of the International Network for Women Engineers and Scientists, and it goes on. She's been recognised as one of the top 100 women of influence in Australia, and she was also recognised in the Queen's Birthday Honours list in June 2014 as a member of the Order of Australia. My great pleasure to welcome Marlene for the launch of the book.
Professor Matu, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it's a real pleasure to be here. This book started with an idea about a year ago, and Professor Matu, in his inimitable style, said, let's do it. So off we went. And we invited authors from all different walks of life, science, engineering, technology, law, business, to make a contribution on what they saw as the key ingredients for success in the Australia-India relationship. So what this book is trying to do, and the title reflects this, and we've got a few authors here as well, I'm pleased to see. The word hullabaloo is in itself a fusion, English-India fusion. And what this book is trying to do is to look for the mirchi in the masala, that little spark. What is it that will make a success of the India-Australia relationship? Because this book could have quite easily been called Great Expectations. We all have this expectation of a great relationship. We can see the potential, but it's just not getting going. It's starting in a small way. There's potential for great diversity of the relationship, not just in education exchange and in resources. Those are the traditional areas, but much broader in what's my particular interest, innovation in science and technology. I think there's huge potential there, exchanges in the arts and in culture. And I think we'll all be the richer for it, not just in dollar terms, but in other terms. All our lives will be enriched, and both nations, I think, will benefit. So I'm very much looking for a little bit of fuss, a little bit of hullabaloo. I hope this starts a conversation and that we can take the Australia-India relationship to even greater success. Thank you.
Emily, we have to ceremonially unwrap
Unwrap the book.
wrap the book. If you could do it while smiling at Cobb there.
And the winner is. Here we go.
Thank you. So now the main business of the night. And I should say that for those of you who are interested, you can follow the conversation on Twitter on #Gandhi oration. So our speaker tonight is, I'm sure, well known to many of you. He's been a visitor to Australia at least twice, and was in fact a speaker at the first conference. In fact, was the main speaker, I think, gave the main oration at the first conference that the Australia-India Institute had. So his presence has been part of the new but now maturing history of the Australia-India Institute. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you back, sir. Shankar Aiyar is a former Indian diplomat turned politician. He's a member of the Indian National Congress Party, and he was part of the first cabinet of the Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh. He served as a minister until 2009. He was born in Lahore, but represented a constituency in Tamil Nadu. And as I say, he's a very distinguished politician, statesman, and we're very honoured, sir, for you to come and invite you to come and give your address to us. Power to the people, the Gandhian version. Thank you. Shankar.
My presentation this evening is entitled Power to the People, the Gandhian version. I'm most grateful to Professor Dr. Amitabh Mattu and the Australia-India Institute for the signal honour bestowed on me of inviting me to deliver the Gandhi oration at the Institute, and that too on a day sacred to the Mahatma's memory, his 145th birth anniversary, celebrated in India as Gandhi Jayanti. I've always thought the essence of Gandhi's worldview was to discover the strength of the asymmetrical. This, of course, was most evident in his non-violent approach to the freedom struggle, where imperialism relied on military strength, economic power, and political domination to establish itself in the country. Gandhi mocked military power, eschewed the search for economic clout, and rejected the quest for political domination, recognizing, albeit implicitly, that battling the empire on its terms was doomed to failure, whereas an asymmetric approach would confuse the opponent and render the advantage to the challenger. And of course, he won. In the same spirit, Jawaharlal Nehru's non-alignment was an asymmetric challenge to the division of the world by others into rival and irreconcilable blocs. Why align with either? He did not, and while in 1947, India was the only non-aligned country in the world, By the time the 7th Non-Aligned Summit was held in New Delhi in 1982, 2/3 of the member states of the United Nations had joined the movement. Asymmetry eventually triumphed. I had explored this theme last time I was here in 2011 to participate in a discussion on foreign policy from Jawaharlal Nehru to the present day. Both these examples are well known and have been dwelt on by scholars more learned, far more learned than I can ever hope to be. But what is less examined and evaluated is the extent to which Gandhi distanced himself from conventional notions of nation building that aimed to making India a great power defined in conventional political, economic, and military terms. He saw India as, quote, a perfect democracy based upon individual freedom, where, again, quote, the individual is the architect of his own government, a moral force whose system of governance would be distinguished by being built brick by brick upwards from the institutions of local self-government, that is the Panchayats, in each of India's 700,000 villages, up to Parliament in New Delhi, through the state assemblies, and not downwards from the center to the humble habitats of ordinary people in their villages. Independence, he said, must begin at the bottom. True democracy cannot be worked by 20 men sitting at the center. It has to be worked from below by the people of every village. If Lenin saw power to the people flowing to them through the Soviets, Gandhi saw power to the people flowing to them from the village councils or panchayats through the constitution then being prepared for the Republic of India. The road he had worked out for the empowerment of the people as the only way to their salvation was best exemplified by his answer to a question on his dream for independent India. Gandhi responded in his journal Young India on the 10th September 1931, and I quote, "I shall work for an India in which the poorest shall feel that it is their country, in whose making they have an effective voice." Unquote. I ask you to note 4 highly significant points in this response, a response of 1 sentence. First, he has no dream for India. He says he shall work for the India he seeks. Action, not empty hopes. Second, the India he will work for is an India in which the poorest have a sense of ownership, that it is their country, not a land which belongs to someone else, or a nation in which they do the work but have no say in what that work should be. Third, that their participation isn't just for themselves, but for the making of the nation. They're not to be passive beneficiaries of someone else's benevolence, but nation builders themselves. And fourth, that in the making of the nation, they have not just a voice, but an effective voice. In 1 sentence, Gandhi has succinctly put the key points that were eventually to inform Rajiv Gandhi's initiative to give constitutional sanction, sanctity, and safeguards to Panchayat Raj. We will explore this theme in the course of this presentation. Gandhi was such a prolific speaker and writer, and his words have been recorded so assiduously that in this lecture I am going to take the liberty of stringing together disparate statements by Mahatma Gandhi on the same theme, but will indicate in the footnotes in the eventually printed version of this lecture the source of these quotations. I trust this will help maintain the continuity and flow of my interpretation of Gandhi's version of Lenin's slogan, "Power to the people." Gandhi based his view of Panchayat Raj on the premise of equality. He said, If we would see our dream of Panchayat Raj, that is true democracy, realized, we would regard the humblest and lowest Indian as being equally the ruler of India with the tallest in the land. He went on to argue that every village can become a self-governing republic. My idea, he said, of village Swaraj, that is self-rule, is that it is a complete republic, independent of its neighbors for its own vital wants, and yet dependent from many others in which dependence is a necessity. Gandhi is often accused of advocating village autarky, but clearly he is not, if he emphasizes interdependence when such is a necessity. In many matters, dependence is indeed a necessity. What he wants is for villages to be as self-sufficient and self-reliant as possible, but also to foster a sense of interdependence for a number of things where multi-village cooperation might be called for, as for instance in building check dams or watershed conservation projects. Gandhi goes on to envisage that the government will be conducted by a panchayat of 5 persons annually elected by adult villagers, male and female. Please note this early advocacy of not just participative democracy, but also of universal suffrage, combined with a high degree of responsiveness to perceived public need, as accountability is built into a system of elections being held once a year. The indifferent, the corrupt, and the exploitative are all put on notice, put in immediate danger of losing their seats. Also notable is the emphasis on universal suffrage in village societies, where those outside the pale of the caste system would be equal stakeholders, as would be women of all castes and classes, a concept revolutionary for its time and place. In asserting these views, Gandhi was at odds with both the modernizers, led by Nehru, who sought a contemporary, westernized, industrial India based on Westminster-style democracy, as well as Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the leading and highly articulate champion of the most disfavored segment of Indian society, called initially the depressed classes, then known as the scheduled castes, after that for a while by Gandhi's term Harijans, or children of God, and now as the Dalits, or the oppressed, but universally recognized by the opprobrious term, now literally outlawed in independent India, as the untouchables. The more Gandhi spoke up for them, or believed he did, the more the leader of the Dalit political grouping, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, opposed the Gandhian scheme of things. This mattered enormously for the future of India. For whereas Gandhi's vision of power to the people rested on self-governing village republics, the alternative view espoused by Dr. Ambedkar rejected the village as the basic unit of Indian democracy. Gandhi had the moral advantage of being the father of the nation. Dr. Ambedkar had the political and practical advantage of being the law minister of India and chairman of the committee established by the Constituent Assembly in December 1947 to draft the Constitution. At a very early stage in the proceedings of the drafting committee, Dr. Ambedkar made it abundantly clear that he had no patience with romantic notions of village life or woolly ideas like Panchayat Raj. Inevitably, this fundamental opposition to his own most fundamental ideas reached Gandhi's ears in what turned out to be virtually his last words on the subject. Gandhi reacted categorically. He wrote, "I am informed that there is no mention or direction about village panchayats and decentralization in the foreshadowed constitution. It is certainly an omission calling for immediate attention if our independence is to reflect the people's voice. The greater the power of panchayats, the better for the people. The principal hurdle to Dr. Ambedkar's plans was removed a few weeks later when the Mahatma was assassinated on 30 January 1948. It opened the way to Dr. Ambedkar circulating in May 1948 a draft constitution that did not even mention the two words Panchayat Raj, the Hindi expression for local self-government. While we must pursue what happened thereafter, let us pause at this moment to reflect on what divided Ambedkar's approach from Gandhiji's. The sociologist Surinder Singh Jodhkar points out that while Gandhi and Nehru hailed from urban centers and did not have even an ancestral village to call their own, Ambedkar was born and brought up in a village, had an ancestral village, Ambavade, from which a school teacher derived his surname, and had and this is a quote from Jodhkar, and had first-hand experience of village life, that too of looking at it from below as a Dalit child. While the fundamental divide between Gandhi and Ambedkar was not in their differences over Panchayat Raj, those differences were grounded in their differences over their approach to social reform. Dr. Ambedkar's view was argued with impressive cogency and outstanding scholarship in a lecture he was not permitted to deliver, but which he published under the title Annihilation of Caste. He argued that a distinction must be made between what he called reform of the Hindu family and what he called the recognition, the reorganization and reconstruction of Hindu society. The latter, that is the reconstruction of Hindu society, required, he said, the abolition of the caste system. Describing the caste system as having two aspects, he said one aspect divides men into separate communities, and the second places these communities in graded order, one above the other, in social status. In consequence, said he, quote, "The ideal Hindu must be like a rat living in his own hole, refusing to have any contact with others." Quoting chapter and verse from various Hindu scriptures, particularly the Manusmriti, held to be the source of Hindu law, Ambedkar said, quote, "Hindus observe caste not because they are inhuman or wrong-headed, but precisely because they are deeply religious. So, what is wrong is their religion which has inculcated this notion of caste." He added, "Reformers working for the removal of untouchability, including Mahatma Gandhi, do not seem to realize that the acts of people are merely the result of their beliefs inculcated in their minds by the Shastras, and that people will not change their conduct until they cease to believe in the sanctity of the Shastras on which their conduct is founded." He urged his audience of pious Hindus and readers, you must not only discard the Shastras, you must deny their authority. You must have the courage to tell the Hindus that what is wrong with them is their religion. Will you, he concluded, show that courage? But, he thought, the task of reform to be well nigh impossible, and therefore had no hesitation in saying that such a religion must be destroyed. Gandhi responded in two successive articles in his magazine Harijan. Both have been reproduced in the latest 2014 edition of Dr. Ambedkar's lecture. After lavishly praising the erudition and sincerity of Dr. Ambedkar and urging that his views be treated with the utmost respect and regard, Gandhi held that, quote, "Many of the texts that Dr. Ambedkar quotes from, the Smritis, cannot be accepted as authentic." He further held that scriptures, properly so called, can only be concerned with eternal verities and must appeal to any conscience. Nothing, wrote the Mahatma, can be accepted as the word of God, which cannot be tested by reason or be capable of being spiritually experienced. From this fundamental proposition, he argued that, quote, caste has nothing to do with religion, unquote. Caste has nothing to do with religion, that caste is harmful both to spiritual and national growth. He asserted that a religion must be judged not by its worst specimens, but by the best it might have produced. In consequence of these firmly but dramatically opposed views, Dr. Ambedkar believed that with caste woven into the warp and the woof of Hindu society, caste hierarchy and caste discrimination had been rendered immutable. Therefore, the Constitution of India must give no place for institutions that would foster caste discrimination. He was persuaded that village panchayats would inevitably aggravate and institutionalize caste domination and caste prejudice, particularly against Dalits, and wished therefore to have nothing to do with Panchayat Raj. Dr. Ambedkar dismissed village self-governance as romanticism, bereft of the recognition of the deeply embedded social inequalities in village India. He said, and I quote, the existing village system has the effect of making the scheduled castes in the village slaves of the caste system. Under the village system, the scheduled castes are not allowed to live inside the village. They have to live on the outskirts. They have no independent means of livelihood. They own no land. They have to do forced labor day in and day out on pain of being driven away from their quarters by the Hindu landlords. They have to live a life of degradation, dishonor, and ignominy from generation to generation. It is a state of eternal perdition. He went further. He insisted that as the Dalits would always be treated by caste Hindus as, quote, slaves, arrangements should be made to remove all Dalit communities from mixed villages and resettle them in communities of their own where they could pursue their own lives without being oppressed as they inevitably would be by Hindus of caste. Principally at his instance, the Working Committee of the All India Scheduled Caste Federation submitted to the Cabinet Mission then in India a memorandum dated 5 April 1946 in which it was argued, inter alia, that the Constitution should provide for the transfer of the scheduled castes from their present habitations and form separate scheduled caste villages away from and independent of Hindu villages. To this end, it was urged that a settlement commission be established to arrange for these exclusively Dalit settlements, that cultivable government land should be placed at the disposal of the settlement commission for distribution to resettled Dalits, that the commission be authorized to purchase new land for purposes of Dalit settlement, and that a minimum amount be prescribed in the Constitution for the settlement commission to accomplish its purposes. It's therefore not surprising that Ambedkar had no sympathy with the concept of village self-governance through Panchayat Raj, where Gandhi visualized village panchayats as the very foundation of an effective and participatory democracy. Ambedkar famously, or notoriously, depending on your point of view, retorted that India's villages were the ruination of India, dismissing them as nothing but a sink of localism, a den of ignorance and communalism. Earlier, speaking in the Bombay State Assembly on the Village Panchayat Bill, Ambedkar had said, if India has not succeeded in producing nationalism, if India has not succeeded in building up a national spirit, the chief reason for that, in my opinion, is the existence of the village system. It made all people saturated with local particularism, with local patriotism. It left no room for a larger civic spirit, none whatever. Under the ancient village panchayats, India, instead of being a country of united people, became a loose conglomeration of village communities with no common ties. Gandhi's diametrically opposite approach had its roots in his seminal 1911 publication, Hind Swaraj, incidentally written during his voyage back from meeting Lord Morley in London in 1909, polished up in 1910, and published in 1911, and which attained its final shape in the Framework for a Gandhian Constitution, published in 1946 by Gandhi's renowned follower, Sriman Narayan Agarwal. In his introduction to the book, which is called A Gandhian Constitution for Independent India, published in January 1946, Mahatma Gandhi extended both his approval and endorsement of the views set out by Sriman Narayan Agarwal. Right from his earliest formulations on the subject of the people's participation in the democratic process, Mahatma Gandhi was concerned with involving the mass of the people and not just the higher echelons of society in governance. He therefore prioritized and pressed for village development as the priority and progressively moved beyond stressing village sanitation and village industries to underlining the primary importance of democracy at the grassroots. He said, India lives not in a handful of her big cities, but in her 700,000 villages, adding that his concern was for the dignity and status of the village unit as against the big cities and of an individual against the machine. He had in mind a modernized democratic version of the traditional 5,000-year-old Indian institution of panchayats, which had weathered over centuries all kinds of central governments, as well as the trauma of military conquest, political turbulence, and economic disruption that have pockmarked the millennial history of the country. However, as against the traditional practice of 5 elders constituting the panchayats, which literally means the council of 5, Gandhi envisaged contemporary panchayats as village councils constituted democratically by democratically elected leaders on the basis of universal adult suffrage franchise and the one person, one vote principle. Indeed, as explained by Sriman Narayan Agarwal, Gandhi was of the view that direct election should be held only to the village panchayats so as to minimize the use of what has come to be known in contemporary India as muscle power and money power. Hence, he advocated the indirect election by an electoral college of panchayat representatives of the members of the state assembly and the indirect election by an electoral college of state assembly representatives of members of parliament in the center. Moreover, far in advance of his contemporaries, India or international, Gandhi bluntly foresaw that natural resources could not be stretched indefinitely to provide for levels of prosperity for all that would match the levels of prosperity attained and aspired for in what we now call the developed world. As Dr. Frank Buchmann, the leader or the founder of the moral rearmament movement, said in words that are often attributed to Gandhi because they so accurately sum up Gandhi's own views on the subject, the earth has enough to give to meet every man's need, but not enough to meet every man's greed. Therefore, his conception of Panchayat Raj rested on virtually self-sufficient village republics, which would be autonomous in everything they did, including meeting the community's economic needs, but restricting these needs to a frugal standard of living. Sriman Narayan remarks, it must be clearly understood that Gandhi does not advocate decentralization because of its economic and political advantages. To him, decentralization envisions and upholds the cultural or spiritual ideal of simple living, high thinking. He does not hanker after raising merely the standard of living, he wants to raise the standard of life. Gandhi himself said, a certain degree of physical harmony and comfort is necessary, but above a certain level, it becomes a hindrance instead of a help. Therefore, the ideal of creating an unlimited number of wants and satisfying them seems to be a delusion and a snare. Although Gandhi's use of the expression village republics did cause considerable alarm, presaging the disintegration of one India into 700,000 self-governing units, just as the country was preparing itself for the trauma of partition, the fact that Gandhi was fighting at the same time for one India in opposition to Jinnah's two nations only meant that far from seeking the balkanization of India, he was actually articulating, and once again far ahead of his time, the governance principle now called subsidiarity as the basis for participative governance. Notwithstanding his radical views on resettling Dalits in separate habitats of their own, Dr. Ambedkar left a narrow avenue out of the dilemma of reconciling his views with those of Gandhi. In his speech to the Bombay Provincial Assembly on the Village Panchayat bill quoted earlier, Dr. Ambedkar hinted at reservations for the scheduled castes in local self-government bodies as being perhaps the way out. He said, and I quote, "Speaking for the depressed classes, therefore, I can never accept the principle of self-government for India unless I am satisfied that every self-governing institution has provisions in which which give these depressed classes special representation in order to protect their rights." And thus, in a memorandum that Dr. Ambedkar submitted to the Constituent Assembly on the 5th of March 1947, he said with respect to local government, "The principles for determining the quantum of representation and the method of election for municipalities and local boards shall be the same as that adopted for the union and state legislatures." It was thus that he eventually accepted a reference to village panchayats in the directive principles of state policy. The argument was not really over the need or otherwise, or the dispensability or otherwise of local government, but over the Gandhian view of the value and validity of village life on the one hand, and on the other hand, the priority to be accorded to village panchayats. Ambedkar's apprehension was what in today's idiom would be characterized as elite capture in a society where discrimination against the lower castes was entrenched in a scripturally sanctioned social system that had survived for millennia and justified itself in terms of the ancient jurisprudential system known as the laws of Manu, India's Hammurabi. Safeguarding against such elite capture was and remains an essential task of Panchayat Raj. Gandhi would not have disagreed. Thus did the principle of Panchayat Raj find passing mention in the Constitution in Article 40. The state shall take steps to organize village panchayats and endow them with such powers and authority as may be necessary to enable them to function as units of self-government. The catch was that by placing issues of local government squarely in the state list, state governments and state legislatures were vested with exclusive jurisdiction over Panchayat Raj, the centre having to leverage a related entry in the concurrent list which talked of the joint jurisdiction of the centre and the states over economic and social planning. Mahatma Gandhi led the traditionalist school that wanted democracy built from below. Ambedkar, the father of the Constitution, fiercely contested the Gandhian view, and Jawaharlal Nehru led the modernist school that first wanted to consolidate the newly independent state at the parliament and assembly levels. The Constitution, as proclaimed on 26 January 1950, reflects an amalgam of all three views and leaves scope for the further evolution of the country's governance system. Therein lies its genius. In the course of the last 6 decades, the Constitution has been amended well over 100 times, but its value system and basic structure remain as they were initially conceived, and following a Supreme Court decision cannot be tampered with. Perhaps the most important and certainly the longest and most detailed of these amendments was introduced by Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in 1989 as the 64th Amendment relating to Panchayat Raj, and eventually passed in 1992, alas, a year after his assassination. By then, it had to be renumbered as the 73rd Amendment and was incorporated as Part 9 of the Constitution. There was a parallel amendment, the 74th, relating to urban local bodies, but that falls beyond the scope of this paper. In regard to Dr. Ambedkar's view, the germane feature of Part 9, as passed, is reservations for the scheduled castes in proportion to their population at every level of the panchayats, village, intermediate, and district. In consequence, of about 2.8 million elected representatives in our panchayats, that's a little more than half the population of New Zealand. A friend of mine from New Zealand is here in the audience, so the remark is directly meant to him. Of about 2.8 million representatives in our elected panchayats, something over 22%, amounting in absolute numbers to some 600,000 elected representatives, belong to the scheduled castes. And of these, some 200,000 are women scheduled caste representatives, whose number and share are increasing as all states progressively move from 33% to 50% reservations for women, as most states have already done. Scheduled caste members are chairpersons in 22% of the panchayats. That is about 90,000 in round numbers, of whom some 30,000 are scheduled caste women. I would imagine that such empowerment of the most deprived in social and economic terms is without parallel in the contemporary world or precedent in world history. The provisions for scheduled tribes are even more impressive, but are alas being observed principally in the breach. Rectifying this is among the major issues of implementation of Panchayat Raj in the country. Dr. Ambedkar's apprehensions have thus been allayed to a significant extent in law, although the utmost vigilance is required in practice to guard against lapses. I will now turn to a comparison between Gandhi's views on the role and functions of the panchayats and the provisions of Part 9 of the Constitution. In the 11th schedule annexed to Part 9 is set out an illustrative list of 29 subjects as the proposed domain of Panchayat Raj institutions. For the purpose of explaining Gandhiji's impact on Panchayat Raj thinking, I'm grouping these 29 subjects into 5 broad headings. First, the productive sector of the rural economy, comprising agriculture, animal husbandry and fisheries, minor irrigation, khadi, that is homespun cloth, and village industry and small industry, as well as rural infrastructure such as rural roads, energy, both conventional and renewable, the maintenance of community assets, and perhaps most important of all, agricultural extension that would bring the best in agricultural technology and best practice to the attention of the smallest farmer and landless labor. Second, the educational sector, including literacy, primary and secondary education, vocational education, skill development, adult education, libraries, and cultural activities. Third, the drinking water and health sector, including sanitation and family planning. Fourth, the social welfare sector, principally relating to the protection and promotion of the interests of the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, now further extended to the other backward classes and the minorities, people with disabilities, women and child development, and the public distribution system. And fifth and last, the environmental sector, including forests and social forestry, and related issues of fuel and fodder. In what was perhaps his most succinct summation of the role he envisaged for the panchayats, Mahatma Gandhi's formulation embraced much of the ambit of the subjects listed in the 11th schedule. He said, perfect sanitation of the traditional kind based on local recycling of human and animal manure. The cottages built of materials found within a 5-mile radius would be well lighted and well ventilated. They would have courtyards where the householders could plant vegetables and houses for their cattle. The lanes and streets would be clean and free of dust. There would be adequate wells accessible to everyone. There'd be places of worship, a common meeting place, a village common for grazing, a cooperative dairy, primary and secondary schools, where the main subject would be practical crafts and village industries. It would have its own panchayats for settling disputes. Finally, it would produce its own milk, grain, fruits, and khadi cotton cloth. This bucolic view of village life, spelt out extempore in a stream of consciousness, virtually covers the spectrum of the 11th schedule. Sector-wise, let me begin with the productive livelihood sectors of the rural economy, particularly agriculture, khadi, and handlooms. Stringing together some of his remarks, I quote, "Poverty is the worst form of violence. Agriculture is a man's true occupation. Our salvation can only come through the farmer. The panchayat should see to an increase in the quantity of foodstuff grown in their village. This is to be accomplished by properly maturing the soil. Trading in soil fertility for the sake of quick returns would prove to be a disastrous, short-sighted policy. It would result in virtual depletion of the soil. Good earth calls for the sweat of one's brow to yield the bread of life. The panchayats should see to cattle improvement. They should show steady increase in the milk yield. The Indian peasant requires a supplementary industry. The most natural is the introduction of the spinning wheel. Khadi is the sun of the village solar system. The planets are the various industries which can support khadi in return for the heat and the sustenance they derive from it. The spinning wheel represents to me the hope of the masses, for the charkha includes all the anterior and posterior industries: ginning, carding, warping, sizing, dyeing, and weaving. These in turn keep the village carpenter and the blacksmith busy. Without khadi, there can be no common bond between the classes and the masses of India. And without a common bond, without feeling as one, no country can accomplish anything, much less India. I get the impression that I've already exceeded my time. So instead of reading the full text of what else I've written, which I hope you'll read as and when this is printed, let me very quickly sum up that I've gone through all this, and what I need to say about the productive sectors is that for all these activities and many more, we now have scores, in fact literally 150 well-funded, centrally sponsored and state schemes. For these, we have increased our outlay in the last 20 years by more than 25 times. At present, the expenditure in Indian currency is over 3 lakh crore rupees. But if outcomes have been derisory, the blame must principally attach to our persisting with bureaucratically driven delivery silos, insulated from each other, and making convergence at the village level impossible. It is only if in accordance with the spirit and intent of Part 9 of the Constitution and in conformity with Gandhiji's vision, we shift the burden of planning and implementation wholesale to the panchayat system, that we will get the true bang we deserve for our buck. I've then gone on to deal with sanitation, which was Gandhi's great preoccupation. He called our villages dung heaps. I also go on to mention that the National Rural Health Mission has funding which is generous and schemes that are numerous, but outcomes bear no relationship to outlays, for the reason that panchayats are marginalized and responsibility is devolved on a bureaucracy that is not accountable to the beneficiaries, but is responsible only to higher echelons of the bureaucracy and the minister at the top of the dung heap. That is why India today, after having a National Rural Health Mission, which is the envy of many developing countries, has more children suffering from malnutrition than the rest of the world, that we have mortality rates, infant and maternal, which are higher than even those in Africa south of the Sahara. And it is not until responsibility is devolved to the lowest level, as Gandhi wanted, that any of these missions or any of this money is actually going to reach the people and deliver outcomes that could be measured in terms that would make an Indian proud. I say the same with respect to our education program. In our education program, we have a huge spending. Today we spend about 20 times what we used to spend in the past, but learning outcomes, as measured by the annual Survey of Education report, show that 56% of class 7 children cannot read a class 2 text, and that nearly half of them cannot add or subtract, leave alone divide or multiply, and that a huge proportion of these cannot count correctly from 1 to 100. So our education program consists of building schools, recruiting teachers, establishing school management committees, and a huge bureaucracy with comprador NGOs working along with them. And the net result is that we have toilets for girls in every school, but very few of the girls are learning anything. And this cannot change until the school teacher and the headmaster are put directly under the responsibility of the local panchayat and have the power to be able to sack the teacher who doesn't come. Today, the best teachers refuse to come to the school because they can then take private tuitions and make a lot of supplementary income by not teaching the brightest children in their own schools. This applies too to social welfare and social equality programs. On untouchability in particular, I have to mention what Gandhi said in view of my having extensively quoted Ambedkar. Gandhi said that it was an inhuman boycott of human beings, that untouchability is not only not a part and parcel of Hinduism, but a plague, which is the bounden duty of every Hindu to combat. And where can this be combated except at the village level? And by insisting that the panchayats have among their many duties the removal of untouchability and all its subsequent forms, because now we don't have any untouchability, but discrimination against the scheduled castes is a fact of life, and it has to be combated at the village level. And finally, as I said earlier, long before it became fashionable to do so, Gandhi saw panchayats as the means of preventing environmental degradation and the promotion of what in today's jargon we call sustainable development. He said, quote, "What we are doing to the forests of the world is but a mirror reflection of what we are doing to ourselves and to one another." Unheard of threats then loom over us, none more threatening than climate change. Yet our national climate change policy makes no mention of the panchayats. Climate change is not a matter for scientists or administrators alone. It involves every person and every habitat. To combat the dangers and consequences, the panchayats must be mobilized as the advance guard. Without them, we are lost. The tragedy is that over the 2 decades that have passed since the Constitution was amended to provide in Part 9 for the panchayats, little has been done to conscientiously implement these provisions. In consequence, outcomes have fallen far short of outlays. Spending on social sector and poverty alleviation programs has risen by a factor of 25 times over the past 20 years. Yet India stagnates at virtually the same position on the UN Human Development Index, 135, as it held 20 years ago. Like Alice in Wonderland, the faster we run, the more we remain mired at the same spot. The fundamental systemic problem is that each of the 150 central schemes is run by 150 or so mutually insulated administrative silos, principally by 150 isolated bureaucracies looking over their shoulders at the ministers who appointed them and not responsible to the beneficiaries, to the virtual exclusion or at best inclusion on the margins of the elected representatives. Or as Rajiv Gandhi put it in Parliament, the sine qua non of responsive administration is representative administration responsible to the electorate. I then refer to an expert committee report which I chaired, which runs to 1,500 pages and 5 volumes. So you will forgive my trying to summarize what I had to say into these 45 minutes or so, but I won't go into that. But amazingly, Gandhi foresaw the critical significance of the 3 Fs, the devolution of functions, finances, and functionaries, decades ago. On functions, he said the basic functions, he put out the basic functions that must be assigned to the panchayats. On the devolution of finances, he said the villagers should be made shareholders of those assets. And on the functionaries, he said there would not be much interference from government whose sole connection with the villages is the exploitation of village revenue. So we cannot progress without the empowerment of the people at large, for it is empowerment that enables unfettered access to entitlements. And as India's burgeoning middle class has shown, it is when empowerment combines with entitlements, entitlements to dignity, entitlements to health, entitlements to education, entitlements to livelihoods, and entitlements to productivity, that enrichment follows. That is the running theme from Gandhi to Gandhi, from the Mahatma to Rajiv. Therefore, let me end by sharing with you Rajiv Gandhi's peroration in the closing phrases of his speech in Parliament when moving the 64th Constitution Amendment Bill. He said, "We trust the people. We have faith in the people. It is the people who must determine their own destinies and the destiny of the nation. To the people of India, let us ensure maximum devolution and maximum democracy. Let there be an end to the power brokers. Let us give power to the people." Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Ashok Malik. Ashok has been a regular visitor to the Institute and a contributor to many forums that we've conducted and is a fellow. He is a senior Indian journalist and columnist. He lives in New Delhi. He writes for many newspapers and journals. I'll just mention one publication, which was his book published in 2012 called India, Spirit of Enterprise, which encapsulates the story of the growth of India's leading private sector industries since 1991 and their role in the Indian economy. So would you please welcome Ashok Malik.
I've got some good news for everyone. I've spent the past 10 minutes editing my speech, so it's shorter than it was when I walked in. I'd like to begin by thanking Robert Johansson and Amitabh Mattu and my friends at the Australia India Institute for inviting me. They've done a lot for the bilateral relationship, really, which we in India do acknowledge, and I hope you in Australia do as well. They've done more than many people do in several lifetimes, and as the relationship between our country grows, these men will be thanked. I'd like to focus today on two aspects of Gandhi. The first is the role of Gandhi and Gandhian thought and ideas on instruments of governance and lawmaking. The second is the role of Gandhi and Gandhian thought and ideas in broader society and in the shaping of politics and ethics, both in India and in the West. The two frames are different, and by sometimes confusing them, we do a great disservice to the Mahatma. We seek to reduce and straitjacket him to unworkable specificities and minutiae of bureaucracy. Gandhi was fortunate in that he was never part of a government. He was never a president or a prime minister. He never led a government. This saved him from the sort of dilemma that confronted a latter-day Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, for instance. As head of the South African government, Mandela once took a decision and said something that seemed to contradict his own position as an anti-apartheid activist. A friend of mine questioned him about this and made reference to a particular contradiction or apparent contradiction at a media conference. Mandela's reply was exceptional. "When I spoke then," he said, "I was prisoner Mandela. This is President Mandela, and President Mandela is a prisoner of the presidency." Gandhi was lucky. He was never a prisoner of a prime ministry or a presidency. He was never caged in or reined in by government. Others were not so fortunate. In India, the wiser among them realized that while the essential ideals and the inspiration of the Mahatma must never be lost, there were and are limits to the putting in practice of Gandhi's precepts and thoughts and into making them workable government policies. Gandhi's closest disciple, his foster son really, was Jawaharlal Nehru. And within years of Gandhi's death, Nehru and the Congress quietly buried the Mahatma's economic doctrine. His emphasis on the self-sufficient Indian village was a noble one, yet it had no obvious place for modern industry and urban job creation, for mass manufacture and principles of comparative advantage, for trade and integrated prosperity. Gandhi was anything but inflexible. Had he lived on, had he embraced public office, he may have changed and revised his ideas and his doctrines a dozen times. It would be judicious to recognize this. It would be judicious to save the essence of Gandhi from latter-day Gandhians. And while it is certainly not anybody's case that Gandhi is irrelevant or obsolete, it would be prudent not to see in him and in what he may have said and written a century ago the answer to all the problems of our age: the environmental debate, the climate change debate, terrorism, the challenges of multiculturalism, everything. This would be to insult Gandhi. The Mahatma's code would militate against the Mahatma's codification. The idea of Panchayati Raj is an alluring and attractive one. Mr. Aiyar has made an eloquent case for it. Panchayati Raj has its passionate advocates in India. Mr. Aiyar is one, and while it may repel him, and my co-speaker may be almost upset at this, another strong advocate is Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Yet, when we move beyond the words and the rhetoric, beyond the discussion rooms and the auditoriums of New Delhi, we need to ask one gripping question. In pushing Panchayati Raj and pouring money into Panchayati Raj institutions over the past 2 decades, have we put the cart before the horse? Have we sought to delegate authority, devolve financial and fiduciary powers, transfer decision-making related to social development and public welfare, before the necessary capacities for these exist in our Panchayati Raj institutions and those who run them? It would be easy to dismiss this as condescending questions or as elitist concerns, but are they entirely without merit? The experience of the past 15 or 20 years in India, and believe me, I travel extensively to rural India, would leave us with a very, very mixed picture. There is also a political argument. It was Congress governments in New Delhi in the late 1980s and early 1990s that promoted the idea of Panchayati Raj legislation. Not everybody may have intended it this way, and I'm sure somebody as fair-minded as Mr. Aiyar did not. But the push for Panchayati Raj did end up becoming the Congress's political response to the decline of single-party dominance in Indian politics, to the rise of regional, state-specific parties, and the emergence of state governments led by non-Congress parties and charismatic politicians. I would contend that one of the purposes of the Panchayati Raj project became to undermine and weaken state governments and instead promote local self-government at the level of the rural district, even without the capacities for effective local self-government, to bypass state governments. Fundamentally, this has led to a trust deficit between New Delhi-based advocates of Panchayati Raj who are keen on an accelerated timetable, but perhaps an unreal timetable, and elected state governments in the state capitals. The issue of the relationship between the union government in New Delhi and state governments is a very, very complex one. It is not limited to perceptions of the promotion of Panchayati Raj. It is also an issue that vitiated the atmosphere between the UPA government of Dr. Manmohan Singh and various state governments, particularly non-Congress state governments, in the 10 years between 2004 and 2014. Indeed, it was one of the themes of the 2014 election in India, and the undermining of state governments became a subject Mr. Modi brought up successfully and frequently in his criticism of the Congress. However, I do admit all of that is fodder for another debate on another day. Here, I would only like to emphasize the paradox, even the hypocrisy, of attempting to institutionalize strong, robust, autonomous, and well-funded Panchayati Raj institutions without attempting to institutionalize strong, robust, autonomous, and well-funded state governments. Yet, this is precisely what many people in New Delhi have sought to do. If I could draw an analogy, and I do admit this is an imperfect one, it would be to presume that it were possible for the Holy Roman Empire to transform itself into the European Union without going through the interregnum of nation states. That would not make for an organic evolution, and let us remember that Gandhi was nothing if not an organic being. The organic, evolutionary, and gradualist nature of Gandhi takes us to the final segment of my talk, about why Gandhi continues to matter to our politics and our discourse. In recent years, particularly after the anti-corruption protest on the streets of New Delhi in 2011, after the fast of Anna Hazare, the Indian political activist, or even after the Arab Spring protest in the Middle East or the ongoing civil unrest in Hong Kong, there has been an enormous interest in Gandhian methods and techniques of political mobilization and dissent. Remembering Gandhi and oxymoronically being amnesic about him is something of a baffling constant in Indian political life. R.K. Lakshman, the Indian cartoonist, put it best in a cartoon published shortly after the release of Richard Attenborough's biopic on Gandhi in 1982. The cartoon showed two Indian politicians, Gandhi cap and all, walking out of the movie theater. One turns to the other and says, "Very moving. I understand it's a true story." In the real world, the amnesia about Gandhi is not so much a reference to specific policy, but to his expansive philosophy and the public potency of Gandhi's methods. The expansive philosophy and public potency cannot and should not be seen as solely within the ambit of government and of laws, whether of a Panchayati Raj law or an overarching anti-corruption law, as Anna Hazare argued for. For better or worse, Gandhi was sold not on the text of a new law, but the subtext of a new awakening. It is sobering to recall here that Gandhi's Dandi March had no legislation change, had led to no legislation change. The iniquitous and completely unfair salt laws only got repealed by Jawaharlal Nehru's government in 1946, 16 years after the Dandi March. Having made his point, Gandhi had moved on. He hadn't marched again and again for the same cause and was conscious of not allowing himself to be changed to one issue, one law, one blockbuster solution, within double quotes. Perhaps the Mahatma was impractical. Perhaps it is the latter-day revolutionaries and anarchists who are the realist. Indeed, it is worth noting, as Jad Adams does in his book, Gandhi, Naked Ambition, that Gandhi's approach would work, in quotes, where there was a common principle and an expectation of civil obedience, where there was a legal framework in which courts showed at least a pretense to objectivity, where there was a standard of common decency to which he could appeal, where there was a free press to publicize injustice and a population concerned about it, where his opponents' ranks contained sympathizers with the nationalist cause who were free to express their views. There was no comparison to life under a totalitarian state. The Gandhian technique works only in a certain framework, in a system that is at least quasi-democratic, recognizes a set of rules, a certain process of law, and a modicum of free speech, or at the very least, an appeal to independent thought. Gandhi is the model dissenter in a democracy. It has to be accepted he would not have survived more than a few weeks under a Hitler or a Mao, under a Stalin or a Mullah Omar. In a sense, this is why he captivates the West and societies such as Australia. When one asks what has caused a whole generation of Western academics and popular writers to attempt to rediscover Gandhi in the recent years, it would be tempting to locate this phenomenon in the politics of the moment, especially of the post-9/11 phase, and in the West's subliminal quest for what I would term the civilized adversary. In the years after 1945, the post-war years, the West has had godless enemies, such as the Soviet bloc. It has had those whose motivation and faith it has failed to fathom, such as Osama bin Laden. Periodically, this has led to an interrogation of the roots of the enemy's hostility. Why do they hate us is a question which is asked about every 10 years. Occasionally, it has forced the conclusion that Western Christianity and its belief system, with its very contextualized geography in Europe, across the Atlantic, and in Australasia, with its admittedly mixed legacy of the Enlightenment, is not compatible with strange idioms from the East. In its crudest form, this sentiment impels a popular rereading of Nostradamus and the identification of the arch-villain of the moment as the Antichrist. In a more reflective setting, it attributes much of the current turbulence on the planet to mutual misunderstandings between the West and Middle Eastern or Central Asian cultures, religious sensibilities, and tools of mass mobilization. This is where Gandhi and his contest with the West offer a compelling alternative model. A Hindu ascetic, a Christian savant, a man who combined somber stubbornness with impish humor, an opponent of British imperialism, but a person who chose to remember the city that sculpted his formative years as Dear London. That's a quote from Gandhi. A person who deftly exploited nuance and subtlety in his opponent's legal system, moral corpus, and sense of fair play. Gandhi is the sort of adversary Western civilization believes it deserves. In a sense, in his book, Catching Up with Gandhi, Graham Turner visits key locations in Gandhi's life. He travels almost as a pilgrim, often in the company of his friend Manmohan Gandhi, the Mahatma's grandson. In a small courtroom in Ahmedabad, the capital of Gujarat, Manmohan and Turner talk of Gandhi's trial in the weeks after the Chauri Chaura violence. Gandhi is charged with inciting disaffection towards His Majesty's government. It was a very intimate encounter with the empire, Manmohan says. There was nothing grand or Roman about it. The judge and my grandfather are so close. They are in a very small room. Yet, it is a defining moment in the battle for the independence of India. As Turner puts it, it also turned out to be an occasion where Gandhi and the Raj's representative were at their best. Both behaved with exemplary courtesy. You have to choose, the Mahatma tells Justice Broomfield, between resigning your post or inflicting on me the severest penalty. This is a convict, an accused who almost invites punishment. By the time I have finished reading my statement, you will perhaps have a glimpse of what is raging within my breast to risk the maddest risk which a sane man can take. Gandhi then outlines, in quotes, how he had been converted from a believer in the empire into its sworn enemy. Justice Broomfield pronounces Gandhi guilty of sedition and sentences him to 6 years in prison. He prefixes this with a remarkable address to the accused, and I quote, "You are in a different category from any person I have ever tried or am likely to have to try. If the course of events in India should make it possible for the government to reduce the period and release you, no one will be more pleased than I," unquote. As a battleground for conflicting political frameworks, that courtroom in Ahmedabad represents a universe far removed from, say, Kandahar or northern Iraq or Syria. That is why, as long as the fires rage, as long as the guns blaze, as long as the bombers fly, as long as the drones go across borders, the West will long for its Gandhi, as we in India will long for our Gandhi. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashok. So can I invite you and Shankar to come up to the front? So we've got time for a few questions. Sure.
My question is about accountability and outcomes. And my limited interaction with the bureaucracy of India, of the general perception of how things move. We feel that in 25 years, the bureaucracy has remained process-driven, hides behind the frameworks which it has, and we can't see any tangible accountabilities. And therefore, what has been done by anyone in the last 20 years to make the bureaucracy more accountable?
Well, thank you for having reinforced my argument. I completely agree with you that the bureaucracy is process-oriented. It's not results-oriented. It's not judged by what the outcomes are, but as to whether the behavior that it is indulged in has been proper or not in the eyes of the Comptroller and Auditor General. The Comptroller and Auditor General, at least the last one, has succeeded in establishing that the job of the Auditor General is not to audit the accounts, but to audit the policies of the government, although he is a bureaucrat, whereas the government is elected. And in these circumstances, I think it becomes all the more necessary to recognize that 67 years after we became independent, there is it is wrong for us to continue to systemically depend upon the bureaucracy. This doesn't mean that individual bureaucrats are particularly irresponsible. It's simply that a system where you are not responsible to the beneficiaries is a system in which you cannot get the results that you want. For example, it's easy for a civil servant sitting in Delhi to work out what the rules should be for a headmaster to attend a school. But who's going to examine at the level of the village, where there may be 5 or 6 schools in a village, that means about 3 million schools, as to whether the teachers are actually coming or not, as to whether the children are learning anything or not. The only way that can be done is if the village council, the Panchayat, is given the permission to hire and fire to determine even what the resources will be. And I don't think the fact that they are not qualified stands in the way of this. For after all, the main argument made by the British against giving us independence was the one that Ashok just now made against giving powers to the panchayats. They said, we're training you up, and a day will come when you are fit for independence, and on that day we'll give you your independence. Whereas I think Nehru proved that he was a rather better administrator with his only experience being in prison than Lord Willingdon or Lord Linlithgow were. And therefore, the best learning is hands-on learning. You throw them into the deep end of the pool, some of them will drown, most will learn how to swim. And so I really think there is no managerial answer to this problem. Rajiv Gandhi thought that there could be a managerial answer by making civil servants more responsible, more oriented towards being responsive to what people said. But at the end of the day, he discovered that even the best bureaucrats, they move to another job, and that there is no guarantee that the person who succeeds him will be of either the same mental orientation or the same desire. And therefore, what we need is not a managerial solution, but a systemic one. And the systemic one means getting out of the administrative system that the British had devised to run a colonial country and move towards one in which we give to the people of India the powers which we are assigning to totally untrained members of parliament. I mean, which minister knows his subject? Did I know a thing about petroleum or natural gas when they made me Minister of Petroleum? Did I know anything about the Northeast when they made me Minister for that? What I had was an army of civil servants who could advise me, who could train me, who could teach me. And then you did your job. But the job was that you got them to work for you and didn't leave yourself just working for them. And so it is in these circumstances that we need to have the simultaneous devolution of functions, finances, and functionaries to make the system work effectively.
And another question, up the back.
It's great to see you live, and it's different from seeing you in television too. My question is, PM Modi just announced Clean India Mission today, and last week Make in India Mission. So in the pretext of Gandhian principle, how you both see Modi?
Could you
How do you both see, today the Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, has launched a Clean India mission,
Swachh Bharat
mission. So how do you both see Gandhi in Modi?
You want to answer that first?
Why don't you start?
Well, I'm surprised that he's launching a Clean India movement today when, as I was going to read extensively to you from what Gandhi had to say about cleanliness, that we've been at this game now for the better part of a century. And the fundamental reason why our villages are not clean, despite having one of the world's best funded sanitation programs, is that the responsibility is not devolved on the beneficiaries. Unless and until there is a linkage made between the system of delivery and what needs to be delivered, I don't think we will secure outcomes that are commensurate with outlays. And unless and until Mr. Modi explains this link, he's been talking about these kinds of issues for the better part of the last 120 days. But I, for one, remain unconvinced, A, because I don't wish to be convinced, but B, because I've seen nothing that he has said which goes beyond empty slogans. It's all very well to say Swachh Bharat, but just by saying Clean India, I don't think a clean India comes into existence. And we need a carefully thought out system of delivery, not merely a statement about sums of money that are going to be given to such a program, or even new titles for old programs. This labeling of Congress bottles with BJP labels is what I would regard as the single most important criticism to be directed against Mr. Modi and his government.
Ashok. No, we'll go to Ashok. And then we'll...
The panel discussion about Modi and his project is tomorrow morning. So I'll stick to that. But coming to this business about a Swachh Bharat, frankly, it's not just an issue with government or with devolving authority, as Mr. Aiyar says. I have worked a bit on sanitation projects. What do you do when the government, state governments and the national government, the central government, fund and subsidize the building of toilets, but families end up using those toilets as extra rooms to store food, to sleep, to do anything, and go out to the village once again for urban defecation? So I don't think it's just a question of devolving authority to village panchayats or those who want to use, those who need to clean their villages and their neighborhoods. Because even Gandhi tried cleaning villages and getting people involved in cleaning villages, and after a certain period they saw Gandhi coming and cleaning their villages as an entitlement and said, do it yourself. So there is a larger social problem we have where we keep our homes very clean but keep the road outside very dirty. Modi managed to combat it in some areas, in some districts, in some neighborhoods, in some segments of Gujarati society and Gujarat's geography. A national movement of this nature will be a much bigger challenge. He's a determined man. I wish him well. I have more faith in him than Mr. Aiyar does. But it's going to be a long haul.
I'll just take one more, and then we'll finish. So.
Yeah, for both the speakers. By the way, Gandhi had a big fight with his wife in the ashram. A small comment in the question. Gandhi had a big fight with Kasturba and the ashram when he wanted everybody to clean the toilets. So Kasturba refused to do that, and they had a very serious. He almost became kind of aggressive with her, and then he repented subsequently. Now, I want to ask both the speakers just a simple question. In the context of today's highly contentious climate change negotiations, Mani, what would Gandhi have done in today's context? Since Mani, before we came here, he told me that Gandhi was the original environmentalist, way ahead of his time.
So why don't you start, Ashok, and then we can...
Yeah.
The mic.
The mic.
What would Gandhi have done before a climate change debate? Let's presume you have a government negotiating at an international conference on climate change, and the government could be Modi's government, could be Nehru's government, frankly, or Indira's government. It doesn't really matter. If the question is about cutting coal, which is what the climate change debate is becoming vis-a-vis India for the moment, cutting the use of coal in the medium term and the near term, I'm afraid whatever Gandhi may have said, and I'm not trying to presume what he would have said, and whatever the West may be saying, no government in India can politically afford to agree. So I think we have to reconcile ourselves in India to a little bit of what some people call dirty growth. In the near term, it's unavoidable. In the long term, we can find solutions to it. But in the near term, it's unavoidable. And it's best if we accept that rather than go into questions of what would Gandhi have said. Does it really matter beyond the point?
I think the example you gave is perhaps the best example of one of Gandhi's remarks about himself. He said, "My life is my message." And he always did attempt to himself set the precedent, to set the precept, and to not live a personal life that was distinct from the life he advocated to others. And I'm grateful to you for giving me the opportunity of reading out to this audience a quotation which I left out because of lack of time, which tells what he had to say about a clean India, and that approximately 80 years ago. He said that instead of having graceful hamlets dotting the land, we have dung heaps. The thing to attend to in the villages are cleaning tanks and wells and keeping them clean and getting rid of dung heaps. Sanitation is more important than independence. Now try and beat that slogan. Village tanks are promiscuously used for bathing, washing clothes, and drinking and other such purposes. Many village tanks are also used for cattle. Buffaloes are often to be seen wallowing in them. The wonder is that in spite of the sinful misuse of village tanks, villages have not been destroyed by epidemics. It is the universal medical evidence that this neglect to ensure purity of the water supply of villages is responsible for many of the diseases suffered by the villagers. All the villagers should know and observe these laws of hygiene and sanitation. We should make no distinction between intellectual and physical labor. And here's the sentence that I want to read to you. To hasten this consummation, we would voluntarily turn ourselves into scavengers. So there is a recognition that if the cleanliness is not the job of government, ultimately it has to be done by the people. But what we know from experience is that all these things, keeping ponds clean and providing safe drinking water, require huge amounts of money to be spent in securing these ends. And instead of giving this money to the bureaucracy and saying, do your best, boy, to reach it downstairs, and he says, I'll first spend it on myself, and after I've set myself up in the village, then what remains will reach the villager, which led to Rajiv Gandhi remarking that 85% of the funds we set aside for social sector and anti-poverty programs goes into administrative expenses, and only 25% reaches the people. If we got the money down to them, I don't think the villagers don't understand that they need to be clean. But keeping the village clean costs a lot of money and requires expertise, and that expertise can be provided by technical people. But the technical people should be working to the orders of the elected representatives of the village rather than to a bureaucracy with whom they get into cohorts. And the bureaucrat knows that he is not going to be applauded unless the NGO reports that he is doing a good job. So the NGO then knows that they won't get the monies from the bureaucracy unless they say the bureaucracy is doing a good job. So we've now invented a second bureaucracy in India, which is the NGO network. And that is why the minute you see a BMW or a Mercedes-Benz in India, you know that it's being run by an NGO.
Thank you. So I'd now like to call on Professor Susan Elliott. Sue is on the board of the Australia-India Institute. She runs the international business of the university. She's been a great friend and supporter of the Institute and of the Australian-Indian relationship. Sue.
Thank you very much. And tonight, on the 145th anniversary of the Mahatma's birth, I think we've had an absolute treat as we've viewed through the eyes of these two men a remarkable life and a brilliant mind, someone who foresaw the Millennium Goals many, many decades before they were seen to be such an important initiative for world attainment of quality of life. Mr. Aiyar, thank you. You've given us an excellently crafted and superbly delivered oration. It is wonderful to hear the Mahatma's words delivered by you. Speech, you're right. We are so fortunate as a community and as a world to have the Mahatma being such a prolific writer and speaker who was so well recorded, and that those words have continued to come through to this auditorium tonight has been remarkable. We've benefited from the asymmetry tonight, Mr. Malik, from your thoughtful response. I think the counterbalance of your two presentations would have appealed to the Mahatma, I believe, if asymmetry was indeed something with which he was seeking. It has been wonderful to view the power and the importance of the democracy to modern India, how the challenges of modern India, including climate change and other global challenges, can be seen through those early words and writings of the Mahatma is indeed remarkable. You wonder, listening to you tonight, whether the fact that India has maintained as a democracy over the last nearly 70 years, while many, many countries in the region or countries of similar size have not managed to maintain that state from an early colonial time. You wonder, in fact, if it was that imprinting within the constitution of the Mahatma's ideas. But thank you very much tonight. We have small gifts, but deep gratitude to give you. So thank you. So thank you very much for coming out on this cold night. It was well worth it, I hope you'll agree, and we look forward to seeing you at future Australia-India Institute events. Thank you.